Chapter 55, Vallejo. Most of the Europeans here were broke bank robbers or small-time meth dealers that got caught up on a conspiracy. Most of the brothers here were ballers. A month after I got there, the same white woman from the rec yard got caught fucking a brother named Tony from Vallejo, California. He used to tell me how she would talk negatively about her husband, a big strong powerlifter with no neck and a Confederate flag tattoo on his forearm. He was also a guard at the prison. She would call him a pervert with weird fetishes that couldn't please her. She told Tony that she was only attracted to black men, and the only place her and her girlfriends could find them in most of Oregon, with the exception of Portland, was at the prison. And that was the reason she applied for the job. Her and her girlfriends would take trips out of state or to the Caribbean just to be with black men, or first becoming pen pals with a prisoner, then strive for a lifetime companionship. When they got caught fucking, her always suspicious husband was who actually caught them in the act. He had duplicated the keys to her office and saw his wife's legs in the air. The next day he put a .357 Magnum in his mouth and blew his own brains out. The local news shows speculated that it was from steroid use, but we all knew the truth. The prison placed a large card in the school building for the prisoners to write their condolences. I wrote, "You big dummy, keep powerlifting in hell where you belong." My Dominican homie wrote, "You're in the best place you could be, dumbass. P.S. And she's still fucking." Tony was taken to the hole and she was fired. 3 months later, he was transferred to a prison in Bastrop, Texas, and she moved there to be with him. It was poetic justice considering the original Oregon State Constitution written by white men that banned all African Americans from entering, working, or owning property in the state until 1926. Now I understood why that law was passed. After 18 months of being a minority in a prison filled with Nazis, bikers, skinheads, and hermaphrodites, I was approved for a transfer. I was 20 years old and over 3,000 miles away from home. I was finally going back to the East Coast, but I had no idea where I would go. I packed up my property, was strip searched, cuffed with belly chains, shackled, and was placed on a van. My short stay in this prison really opened my eyes to racism and made me more intolerant to bigots. My transfer ended up being delayed because as we arrived at the airport to board on an old 1969 propeller-driven airlift, the flap on one of the plane wings fell off. The officers laughed and told everyone on the bus that we were lucky it didn't fall off in mid-air. We would be cuffed and shackled on the plane, but they had parachutes just in case. They would have bid us all farewell and bailed out. They then returned us back to the prison for 2 weeks until the plane was repaired. 2 weeks later, we went back to the same airport to board the same plane. We didn't have the option to refuse. If anyone tried, they would have been carried onto the plane and strapped down. Everyone had their fingers crossed. Some of the guys said prayers. As we got to the airport, I wondered, was Mount Hood named in the honor of the hood the KKK wore? As we flew past it, I raised up my cuffed hands and gave the whole state of Oregon the middle finger. I was flown to El Reno, Oklahoma once again to be held over, then to Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, with my destination being Fernton, New Jersey. The Vineland National Guard Armory was 18 minutes away. While on the West Coast, the homies out there always told me that a civil unrest was bound to happen. They were just hoping to be home when it did so they could participate. The trial for the pigs that had beaten Rodney King was moved from the heavily Latino and African American Los Angeles and into the mostly white suburb of Simi Valley. A jury composed of 10 Europeans, an Asian, and a Latino that took arguments from an African American prosecutor acquitted the officers of all charges 14 months after the beating. Legendary filmmaker John Singleton, who was in the crowd at the courthouse as the verdict was announced, accurately stated, "What these people done is lit the fuse to a bomb." LA erupted in flames. The civil disobedience had begun where close to 70 people would be killed and as many as 2,400 injured in 5 days. material losses to the city estimated to be over $1 billion. I was now in a federal prison in Farrington, New Jersey, standing in the back of the TV room by myself watching it play out, but mad I couldn't be of assistance. The compound had a lot of Italian Mafia figures, and it was a few in my block. They kept to themselves, and some even walked with their chin up as if they were really important. Word on the pound was that they were all racist, and one was just beaten earlier that day for calling a black man a nigger and telling him to go back to Africa. I was flabbergasted. Most African Americans are indigenous to America and have ancestors that can be traced back hundreds of years. Yet, newly arrived immigrants from Europe had the nerve to utter, "Go back to Africa," towards the very same people who fought and died for equal rights, which they themselves now benefited from. They were mimicking the people that even hated them. They were mimicking the same people who held a mass lynching of Italians in New Orleans in 1891. And Teddy Roosevelt famously saying that it was rather a good thing. The organizer of the lynching, John Parker, who said Italians were worse than the Negro, being filthier in their habits, lawlessness, and treachery. He later became the governor of Louisiana. The New York Times once called them sneaking and cowardly Sicilians, the descendants of bandits and assassins. Italians were also immigrants and stereotyped as thugs, criminals, and mafia as a whole. They also had a long history of bigotry towards Africans in Italy. They had invaded and attempted to colonize Ethiopia on more than one occasion, and they were defeated every time. They once executed over 30,000 dreadlocked Ethiopians and used their skulls to build a wall. Many more of them were executed as a response. A few years prior to the Rodney King incident, 16-year-old Yusef Hawkins was chased and killed in Bensonhurst, New York by a mob of 30 Italians, just for going into their neighborhood to inquire about a used car. As young men, we were naively intrigued and misguidedly idolized the Italian, Irish, and Jewish mafia figures. The Lucianos and the Lanskys, the Gottis, Lepkes, and the Capones. Hollywood did a great job glamorizing their criminal exploits and organizations. Movies like The Godfather and Goodfellas were a celebration of crime. We saw them as rebels to the system that broke laws and created their own. Exactly how we wanted to live. They set the standards for criminal activity. They made organized crime appealable to all the unorganized crews. They even had crooked American, white, Irish, and Italian cops, judges, and politicians on their team. They had colorful names but were mostly low-key, even refusing to acknowledge that they even existed. When they went to war, it was epic. High-profile bombings and choreographed assassinations. High-powered weapons spraying their adversaries in crowded restaurants with no innocent bystanders harmed. They had rules and regulations. To become a made man, you had to perform rituals and prove your loyalty. And a made man cannot be killed unless it was sanctioned by a vote of other made men. Otherwise, retribution was swift and deadly. They hated rats and extorted the weak. They were the epitome of crime. The real thugs and goons, the real criminals. Yet they looked their noses down on us. We blindly looked up to them until we actually met some of them. After being in their presence, we began to look down on them. We now understood that they weren't anything special. We were idolizing people that didn't even like us. We were idolizing John Gotti, Al Capone, Albert Anastasia, Bugsy Siegel, and Vito Genovese, all racist wannabe white supremacists. In reality, they should have been idolizing us. They should have been paying homage to us. They should have been thanking us, because without us, white Americans would have continued to torture and discriminate against them. At this time, John Gotti had just been convicted in federal court and sentenced to life. He was a well-known and well-documented racist that hated black people. But we didn't know this until later on. Years later, while serving his life sentence in USP Marion Federal Penitentiary, after spewing some derogatory words, a homie beat his ass like he was a child, knocked him to the ground and kicked him in his face a few times, even spat on him for his reckless mouth. He then attempted to hire the Aryan Brotherhood to kill the homie. It never happened. But if it would have happened, his Mafia family would have experienced a bloodbath in the prisons like nothing they've ever experienced before. DC dudes ain't nothing to play with. Fuck you mean?